Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Hannah Doman, and I'm a senior research analyst at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. On Monday, CSET launched a major update to our Chip Supply Chain Explorer, a tool that offers policymakers and researchers an open, interactive way to understand the essential inputs, countries, and companies involved in producing advanced chips. Accompanying this, we also published a report called Inside Beijing's Chip-Making Offensive, Where is China Gaining Ground?, in which Jacob and I analyzed China's progress in chip-making equipment over the last 5 years. To get us started, Jacob will kick us off with a short presentation highlighting our key findings. After that, we'll dive into a discussion about China's progress and the implications for US policymakers and industry with our outstanding group of experts. We'll also have plenty of time for audience questions in the second half of the discussion. Our goal here today is to have an open, engaging, and thought-provoking discussion. So as questions come up to you while our panelists are presenting or speaking, please feel free to begin sharing your questions, thoughts, and comments in the chat, and we will do our very best to cover as many questions as we can throughout the discussion. Before I turn it over to Jacob, let me share 2 logistical points. All attendees' microphones are muted, and if you experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to alert us, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. And now let me introduce Jacob. Jacob Feldgoys is a senior data research analyst at CSET. His work explores US-China technology competition, US export controls and semiconductor supply chains, China's foreign influence, and emerging technologies talent flows. Previously, Jacob was a James C. Gaither Jr. Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has worked for the US House of Representatives and the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. He also studied Mandarin in Shanghai on a Boren scholarship. All right, over to you, Jacob.
Thanks so much, Hannah. All right. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about 2 things over the next few minutes. First, I'm going to talk about data and features that we've added to the Supply Chain Explorer, which I'm going to call the Chip Explorer for the remainder of this presentation. And I'm also going to talk about some analysis we did to look at changes in market share, country market share of chip making tools from 2019 to 2024, where we found that Chinese companies have made progress across many of the major tool categories. The Chip Explorer, as Hannah mentioned, is an open source and interactive flowchart that walks you through the chip production process from design through fabrication to assembly, test, and packaging. It shows you the production processes in each stage and the critical inputs to each process. It also shows you for each input market sizes and country and company market shares where those data are available. You can visit the link in the chat, which is chipexplorer.eto.tech, to access the Explorer and play around with it. You'll also be able to access all of our documentation, code, and data. This tool is great for 3 things in particular. First, for visually exploring the chip supply chain and learning more about the different processes, tools, materials, providers that are associated with it. It's also great for assessing a country or company's role in the supply chain using the filters in the tool. Lastly, it's great for identifying choke points, market concentration, dependency relationships, and other structural features of the supply chain. CSET's Emerging Technology Observatory launched the Chip Explorer back in 2022, and we're so excited that we now get to share a major update with you. First, we've updated the data to 2024 when available. Most inputs in the Chip Explorer are different types of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So these are, for example, lithography tools made by ASML, or deposition tools made by Applied Materials, or etch tools. And what we've done is we've updated all of those equipment inputs to use 2024 data from our data provider, Tech Insights. Second, we added company-level market shares. So previously, when you visited an input node like the one on the screen, you would have seen supplier countries and their market shares, like the chart there, and then also a list of companies. But now what we've done is added a second chart that shows the market shares of supplier companies as well, so that you can get a better sense of how important each given company is to each given input. Both of these changes are live on the Chip Explorer for you to check out right now. But beyond this update, we wanted to look at what's changed in the market since 2019. Particularly, we wanted to look at where China has gained market share. What we found is that overall, China has slowly but steadily gained market share since 2019 across a variety of high-level equipment categories. So what we're looking at here is each country's percentage point change in market share by tool category from 2019 to 2024. And I want you to focus in particularly on this China column. And what you'll notice is that it's all blue. There's no red. We saw no major declines in market share across the major categories, and we saw some pretty substantial increases. Specifically looking at the top 6 tool categories, which are for fabrication equipment, 3 of the top 5 percentage point increases were from China. We also found that China is positioning itself to lead in advanced packaging. Advanced packaging is where chip makers are trying to tightly integrate multiple chips, partially in an effort to compensate for slowdowns in Moore's law. And these techniques rely much more heavily on specialized fabrication tools than does conventional packaging techniques. What we found is that China has gained significant market share in these fabrication tools for advanced packaging. And particularly, I want to call your attention to etch and clean tools for advanced packaging, where we saw Chinese companies gain 10 percentage points in market share in that category, raising their total in 2024 to 18%. I also want to call it that we specifically looked at fabrication tools for advanced packaging here. We didn't look at assembly tools for advanced packaging, which are also very important. These are, for example, thermocompression bonding tools or hybrid bonding tools. This is an avenue that we think would be really fruitful for future research, and we're hoping to do some more analysis there. Our third finding is that China has made no progress in lithography market share. As of 2024, China holds about 0.2% of the lithography market. And when we looked at the subset of lithography where we expected Chinese companies to have made the most progress, so these are lithography tools for legacy fabrication, I-line lithography tools, China holds only 4% of that market in 2024, up from 3% in 2019. Here, I think it's also important to emphasize that what we're looking at with all of this analysis is changes in market share, not changes in capability. So these data are not going to capture companies that are in the R&D process developing lithography tools or anything else. And those new types of equipment are not going to be represented in this data until they basically reach the commercial market. So to recap, we saw that China has made slow but steady progress since 2019, and that they've gained particularly in chemical mechanical planarization tools, deposition tools, and etch and clean tools. Second, we saw that China is positioning itself to lead in advanced packaging through gains in fabrication tools for advanced packaging. And lastly, we saw that China has made no real progress in lithography market shares. For more, please check out the analysis that we published, which is linked in the chat. And with that, thank you very much. I'll hand it back to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And now let me introduce our panelists. I'll start with Dan Kim. Dan is a globally recognized expert and experienced leader in semiconductor markets and policy. Throughout his career, Dan has served in executive roles at semiconductor companies such as SK Hynix and Qualcomm, and as a senior official with the United States government across 4 presidential administrations. Prior to joining Tech Insights as Chief Strategy Officer, he was Chief Economist and Director of Strategic Planning and Economic Security at the U.S. Department of Commerce for its Chips for America program. Our next panelist is Mario Palacios. Mario is a Senior Director of Government Affairs and Head of International Trade Policy for Applied Materials. Prior to his current role, Mario served as Senior Managing Director for International Trade and Technology Policy at Intel. In his capacity, he was responsible for leading Intel's global government advocacy efforts in areas of national security, supply chain resilience, and global trade in support of Intel's international network of research and development, manufacturing, and sales locations. And last, but certainly not least, Saif Khan. Saif is a distinguished fellow at the Institute for Progress. Saif served as counselor for critical and emerging technologies to Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo and as principal advisor and coordinator on AI policy. Saif also served in the White House as Director for Technology and National Security at the National Security Council, focusing on semiconductor, AI, and quantum information technology policy. Saif was also a visiting professor at of the practice at the University of Maryland Applied Research Lab for Intelligence and Security and a research fellow at CSET. But unfortunately, that was prior to my time, so we did not overlap at CSET. But we're really excited to have Saif here in particular because a lot of this work is also built off of the work that he did while he was here at CSET. We're really excited to have you all here today. So I'd like to start with your reactions to the analysis that Jacob just presented and what we published in the blog posts on Monday. So maybe let's start with you, Dan. What do you find most worrying or reassuring about the data from a policymaking perspective?
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here and for this wonderful panel. Let me just say thank you for using our data. Tech Insights data is unique in this kind. Let me just actually introduce some additional data that you don't see here, if that's okay, as a little preview, and our subscribers certainly can see all of this as to what is worrying. So I think the data tools that you provide here provide excellent high-level view of what is happening in a macro view, but I think it gets more difficult to drill down. So let me make 4 quick points with quick data. One is that generally, in the last 20 years or so, the equipment industry has consolidated, and that's because scale matters. The exception to that is China. So if we count between 2010 and 2025, a 15-year span, the number of companies that we have tracked, because they have significant revenue for us to count, the US, European, Japanese companies have generally decreased by about 30%, the count of companies that we track. So for the US, about 120 companies down to about 85 companies. European companies went from about 70 companies down to about 45, Japanese companies from 90 to about 60. In the meantime, Chinese companies that we track have gone up by triple, so from 9 to 27. So they are going opposite the direction of the industry, and we can sort of get to why that could be. So that is one worrying. If the industry is looking for reasons to worry, that is one worrying aspect of it. The other aspect of it is the growth of China in terms of consumption of the equipment itself. So how large is the Chinese market? If we go back all the way to 2007, China consumed about 7% of the fabrication equipment, the front end. And at that point, Japan consumed about 22%, US consumed about 16%, Taiwan about 23%. Now, last year, China consumed 35% of the equipment in terms of revenue value. US in the meantime consumed about 13%, and Japan consumed about 9%. It sort of generally tracks the wafer capacity within that geographical area. But what China is doing is they're consuming even more than their current capacity, meaning that they're poised to grow even further in terms of the wafer capacity. So if you're an equipment company, China is not a market that you could ignore if you care about your revenue and your R&D capacity. Cannot ignore it. And that has to matter. Third is just wanted to provide some company level growth from 2019 to 2024. 2019, if you are sort of tracking the export controls that have come into place. If you look at sort of national champions among US, Europe, Japan, and China, in the US, 4 companies, including equipment providers for packaging, it ranges from growth between 1% to about 18% of CAGR between 2019 and 2024. For China, between two companies that have grown the most, or at least have the most revenue, the revenue CAGR has been somewhere between 50 and 60%. Now that does start from a low base, and that explains the growth, because it starts from a low base, and of course the incumbents have a higher base to grow from. But 50% growth is green light essentially to invest more capital into that company in a market-based system. And that is on top of the subsidies that they receive from the government. So that is the other trend. So what can we draw from those? Let me just suggest a few things, and I'm really interested to see what the panel has to say. One is that China tends to, in their industrial policy, measure success in decades and not quarters. And I think that's what we're seeing here. In a place where there is consolidation and scale matters, they have decided that it doesn't, right? That they're willing to do whatever it takes to grow. Second is that China is less sensitive to oversupply concerns across the entire stack, meaning not only in the equipment space, but in the fabrication space as well. They're willing to risk oversupply. Third is that China is not yet an exporter of equipment, a major one at least, but they can be poised to do so if the regulations allow and if the fabs would prefer that, and as they get better in the technology. Fourth is that China generally prefers vertical integration if and when it's possible, and I think an interesting example of this would be how Huawei is trying to integrate its supply chain. And I think one company to watch here would be SiCarrier, a company that we're watching closely here at Tech Insights, in that they're clearly having lots of R&D go into this space, to echo Jacob's point, into at least 5 or 6 different categories of equipment, and have started to win some wins downstream. So all of that said, I think the data that you're presenting here on your platform is an excellent start. And for those that are observers of this, there is a need for us to watch a bigger picture, but also drill down to specific to see where the threats and risks could be.
Wonderful, Dan. Really insightful remarks, and I think there's a couple of threads we can pick up on in the discussion. But I want to give maybe Saif now an opportunity to weigh in with his thoughts, and then we'll let Mario weigh in.
Yeah, that additional data was incredibly insightful. Just to kind of put kind of a broader wrapper on that. Obviously, there's one baseline point that we all need to acknowledge, which is, there's been this industrial policy in place since 2015, and they've kind of telegraphed their intentions here. And I think this is just kind of the fruition of at least some of those goals, even though they've had kind of a mixed track record of actually achieving some of the indigenization objectives. One of the additional kind of pieces of data, not specifically in the Explorer, is that we are also seeing a little bit of an increasing focus in the China IC Industry Investment Fund, which folks call the Big Fund. A little bit more focus in that fund on SME as well. I mean, I think it actually might kind of relate a little bit to Dan's point where you've had this something like 50 to 60% CAGR over time. And, in the early stages, a few years ago, the base was very small and there was kind of a limited absorptive capacity of how much subsidy the industry could take. But now that industry is starting to grow a little bit more, and that actually increases the absorptive capacity. And I think that is in part caused the Big Fund to allocate more resources there. Now, I guess, obviously, given that industrial policy, I think to some degree, some of this has all been expected. Nevertheless, I would say what's worrying is that, the increase is indeed happening, and China's confirmed their drive and applied increasing focus. And I would say the U.S. government maybe has not exercised the degree of policy leverage to slow them down and maintain U.S. and allied market share as we'd like. But it's also, I think, reassuring maybe in some other senses in that, I think the data reflect that, a lot of the gain is in less complex or legacy equipment, as that means at least the U.S. and allies retain a relatively strong chokehold on advanced SME. Obviously, like they have done in other segments, they're going to try to work up the value chain, first master legacy, then start producing more advanced equipment. So it's not a reason to be entirely reassured. But there's a real question of whether, at the more advanced levels, they can actually recapitulate the decades of accumulated know-how in the US and allied equipment industry.
Great points. Thank you, Saif. Over to you, Mario.
Well, the benefit of going third is I can say I agree with what was said before me. So the only 2 points I would make is Chinese domestic equipment makers are doubling in size every 2 years. I think the data reflects that. I think the focus on process tools, or those tools that are non-lithography, is also very important as well. The focus here is on how can companies compete against other Western firms, not just U.S. firms, but Western firms in this non-litho space, especially as somebody mentioned earlier, I think it was Jacob, challenges to Moore's law and feature size, dimensional shrinkage of the chip is becoming more and more focus for the overall industry. The last thing I'll say is, if you look at the top 10 semiconductor equipment companies globally, 2 of the 10 are now Chinese. If you looked at that same list 5 years ago, 7 years ago, Chinese firms were way behind the established global industry leaders. So I think we should kind of look at that as not just incremental market segment share gains, but also technology gains and their ability to introduce themselves and their tools in the process flows of many of the major foundries and semiconductor manufacturers globally.
Thank you, Mario. I think maybe to continue the conversation, right, that Dan started a little bit about the consolidation trends, or maybe lack thereof, in China, right? You'd mentioned that, maybe we can start with why specifically that is, and also whether you expect that to remain the case, right? I think we've seen some reporting already of that, not of some companies maybe consolidating in this SME space. Curious, how you expect that to continue.
Well, I'll take a shot at here. Saif mentioned the big fund, and I think there's 2 demand drivers. There's one demand driver and there's one supply driver here. I think that's hard to ignore. One is that because so much of the wafer capacity growth has been happening in China and is poised to do so for the next foreseeable future, the choices that the Chinese fabs make has such a bearing on the opportunities for Chinese equipment companies to enter into the market. And as long as they keep up with that kind of growth, it does provide room for them. And this is something that I think is not born in data, but I think would be, if you're a policymaker, will be really be wise to listen to equipment makers and their experience on the ground, is something like this. Are you observing in a Chinese fab in which you're operating that the fab operators are actively attempting to replace your tools with Chinese tools for non-critical layers? So you might, for example, at a fab outside of China, if you like a tool, you might just put for that particular thing, for that particular step, just use that tool and many of the same tool to make sure you have predictability. And I think that's really important. What folks don't realize a lot of the times is semiconductor production is incredibly precise. If there's 3,000 steps in a semiconductor production, and you have 99% yield rate per step, you get 0% yield at the other end of it, right? That's just simple math of raising. That's a simple math of it. You have to get 99%, 9999% yield at each step for you to start to have commercial yield. So under normal scenarios, you would not want to risk a subpar or substandard equipment in your fabs, because any kind of substandard equipment could jeopardize your entire yield and therefore your business. if rules don't apply to you, then you might be motivated, if not mandated, to try to use alternative equipment for certain layers that may not be as critical. Are we seeing that? I think that's interesting to observe. The other thing I would point out is we have seen incredible growth of wafer fabrication in East Asia, particularly from South Korea as consolidation of the memory industry, but also in Taiwan because of their incredible success in the foundry aspect of things. They have grown in huge capacity without growing the equipment market share along the way. Their philosophy was very much, we want to be the very best at producing memory or logic chips or whatever it might be for foundry, while using the best equipment available. And that best equipment available was usually from North America, from Europe, and Japan. And so there was essentially a technology partnership being formed with these countries, with these companies, to create a global semiconductor industry. It seems that the goal in China is very much not that. They want to be able to leverage the best tools there can be, but they clearly also have a goal of trying to substitute that away for as long as possible. And I think one thing that is very notable here is that that was always the goal, even before the US export controls came into place. So I think a narrative that says, oh, they want to just substitute away because of export controls, I don't think holds water for me, because they were trying to do that before. And it's been a stated goal before that and continues to be. And so I would say for things like this, get really granular and listen to the experience on the ground as to what is happening from the ones that are operating the equipment in the fabs.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think you brought up export controls, and of course that that's it's hard to not talk about export controls when we talk about SME and the chip industry in general. So I'm curious, maybe Saif and Mario, maybe you can talk a little bit about, from your perspective, we heard a little bit about, Dan's perspective, but from your perspective, what role have export controls played kind of in this story in China's progress over the last 5 years? And what does that mean about how we should maybe think about export controls in SME moving forward in particular? And maybe we can kind of talk about some of the costs and benefits of the controls.
Yeah, so I'm happy to give some first quick thoughts. I tend to kind of initially agree a bit with Dan that probably there are kind of other primary drivers rather than export controls that are driving this trend. Kind of before getting into the data a little bit, there was also even a Bernstein research analysis from last year that assessed that China's equipment indigenization was more so predicted by market and technological complexities rather than export controls. And then it was really interesting to dive into this data set here. I guess there's a few pieces of data that suggest export controls are not playing a role, others maybe, but just to walk through some of those that I found interesting. One is for really advanced deposition tools like atomic layer deposition, which are used in, say 14 nanometer and below processes. I think the data shows, there's not been much improvement in China. And then you look at deposition broadly, China did see increasing market share, but actually they took most of that market share from Japanese companies, not US, even though I'd say the US controls on deposition equipment are somewhat more restrictive. Advanced packaging is an area where China has seen a lot of increase, but that's an area where there's relatively fewer restrictions. Then you see massive gains in discrete test, for example, which is very legacy, low complex area that is not subject to export controls. And then you see a lack of gain in some areas that are export controlled, like process control. On the other hand, there's some very, striking data sets like in CMP equipment that you guys described, where, Huaxing has just taken some market share from Applied Materials since 2022, which kind of corresponds to some of the increased export controls. And then dry etch, you see AMEC and Nora taking some market share from Lam. So I think there's a kind of a mixed set of data here. I think in general, it says it's tough to draw the conclusion that export controls have played at least a primary driver. You can argue maybe that the U.S. and allied thrust on export controls has motivated Chinese equipment makers to indigenize, even in places where our export controls are not currently applied, because they see it as unreliable to rely on U.S. and allied equipment companies. But then the counter to that is that they've had this goal even before the export controls were put in place. So I would say, kind of also tying this to the previous points that Dan made, we had this back when I was at CSET, a paper in 2021 called, China's progress in semiconductor manufacturing equipment. We had laid out 5 factors for, we called them accelerants for what the Chinese equipment industry could do to increase market share and their technological capability. And I think that kind of framework to me holds up. There's subsidies, of course, and I think that probably is one of the key factors that is kind of driving against this market trend of consolidation, where you're able to prop up an additional set of companies. There's actually one of the key policy challenges, which is, most SME actually relies on very complex components and subsystems, and it's usually not the equipment provider that themselves are making a lot of these components. And so, there's a concern that they are importing many of these subsystems and components to make their own tools. There are some export controls in place here, but this is an area that is actually a little bit less consolidated, and there are more supplier countries than for the equipment themselves. So it creates some additional challenges to create effective export controls there. But I think that's probably a priority area for the U.S. government. And then a really key point that I think Dan has really, pointed out quite a bit is, the collaboration between, Chinese fabs and the Chinese equipment companies, that vertical integration. They have this really large domestic market to experiment in. I think Dan noted the Korea example. Yeah, I mean, I think that was a case where the Korean equipment industry didn't take off. That was a little bit later in time than Japan. And it was a time when you had a lot of the consolidations trends in place. But actually, in some ways, the Chinese, success story here, at least preliminary success story, more so mirrors the Japanese experience, where they had significant market share in semiconductor production in the 80s, and then throughout the 80s, they were able to indigenize the supply chain for equipment as well. So there's actually kind of a historical analog here. And then the other element is knowledge transfers, both explicit and tacit, which I think are definitely part of the equation.
Thank you. Mario, go ahead. I see you unmuted.
I remember when export controls was uncool and people ran away when export controls was the topic of discussion. Now everybody seems to be flocking to talk about export controls. Look, I'll say that, when you're looking at establishing, developing, and then also implementing export controls on an industry like semiconductors that has a huge global diffusion of providers of software, technology, hardware, et cetera, you have to work alongside those allies, right? Or those other countries who are providing technically capable, ready drop-in replacements for an item, whether it's SME or whether it's something else. So I think that's what's important and critical. The other interesting element here is, chip fabricators co-qualify tool sets per process step, right? So Dan mentioned 3,000 steps, right? You're running, a fab 24 hours a day, 365. You have around 2, maybe 3 tools qualified for each step to ensure redundancy, right? So ensure you don't have any lines down situations. Any delay is massively costly, not just from a financial perspective, but also it could be from a technological perspective as well. So because of these dynamics, it's just always been this way. Chinese SME, indigenous SME knows this, right? So you could have scenarios where you have a Chinese equipment item co-qualified alongside a non-Chinese item, right? So that tool is learning from those other tools, right? You have a lot of repetitive steps, so you can learn a lot over time. Those are just, again, situations where maybe U.S. equipment makers are not in those fabs. And I think that's something, just to Dan's point on observation and government asking industry for observation. Absolutely, industry plays a huge role. Industry has insights that non-industry participants don't have, but we can only make observations in fabs we're in. So I think that's where collaboration with foreign governments is important, because we happen to be not in fabs that they're in, right? So I think that, again, the ecosystem of collaboration of intergovernment communication is also very critical. One, to ensure implementation of controls, enforcement of controls, but also sharing of critical intelligence of capability.
That makes sense. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I see that we are now getting some questions in the chat as well. And just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, please drop them in there. I'll start kind of weaving some of those in here into the conversation as well. I think one of the questions I was also gonna ask about, I mean, I think a lot of times when we talk about semiconductor manufacturing equipment, the first thing that people think of is lithography. And I think, Mario, you already mentioned this. There are obviously other parts of the supply chain that are incredibly important as well, but that is generally where a lot of the focus is. And I see one of our questions, one of our panelists asked kind of when we expect Chinese lithography equipment makers to make advanced DUV immersion lithography and maybe EUV. I know that's a hard question to answer, and I think we already talked about how our data is maybe not. It's not the full picture to the story, right? There are I think you all have mentioned this, but there are collaborations, vertical integration with Huawei specifically, and looking at the companies and other projects that are going on in China that are working on developing lithography tools. So I'm curious if one of you would like to weigh in on kind of where you expect that to go, and what we can expect in the next 5 years, 10 years. How certain can policymakers be that this will remain a choke point in the coming years?
I'm happy to jump in with the first quick thought. I think it was in late 2019, also at CSET, we had some analysis at that time suggesting that it would be at least a decade until China developed a competitive EUV tool. I think 5.5 years in, that prediction is looking pretty good. In fact, like even 10 years, which would put us at the end of this decade, looks a little bit optimistic. I think that is especially borne out by looking at some of the DUV data where you have 3 segments of DUV: argon fluoride immersion lithography, argon fluoride dry, and then krypton fluoride, which gets you all the way up to kind of in the range of the 300 or so nanometer range, which is quite legacy equipment. And we've not seen real market share development even in those segments. You've had Shanghai Microelectronics, which is arguably China's leading equipment maker in this segment. And, they've had, announcements over the last few years. I'm thinking back to like 2020 or 2021, where they, had a 28 nanometer immersion lithography tool that, purportedly was going to be out on the market. And I think we look a few years later and that's still not the case. So it's actually a question of, with that 10-year prediction, it seems very likely for EUV, and it's actually the case that maybe even for DUV immersion, we're going to get at least something close to those timelines. That said, I would say this is an area where they're working, and I think we can expect to see some progress over the next few years. EUV is a much tougher nut to crack.
Go ahead, Dan. I see you unmuted as well.
Yeah, well, I wanted to double down on the point that I was trying to make, is that China tends to measure its success in decades and not quarters. And remember, EUV required at least 2 decades of research to really commercialize. And so if we are seeing an intense R&D spend and competition within China, then I think the idea of where choke points might be is decades long question, right? And so I think if for policymakers, I think it's important to remember that the effectiveness of policy has to be measured in long term as well. So there needs to be some patience required, but also at the same time, nimbleness to know when things are working and when it's not. So there's some things that you know immediately when it's working, and some other things you don't know if it's quite working until years from now. And that's what makes the job difficult, but I think, worth doing. Is it okay for me to answer a couple of questions in the chat? Because I see a couple of my old friends here that have asked questions. Hassan asks, hello, Hassan. Thank you for listening. Are Chinese equipment makers exporting it out? How much is it selling outside of China? So Tech Insights actually doesn't provide too much granular data on that. But what we are observing, interestingly, through surveys of satisfaction that we do. So we send out a survey to the fabs to measure their satisfaction of the tool makers and the tools themselves. And we ask specifically about companies, and we are starting to see high scores of satisfaction of Chinese equipment, both within and in some cases outside of China. And that's new. And so, like I said before, I think we could expect to see a little bit more of that if they're allowed to do so. Michael asks, hello, Michael Dang, how effective is market share as a standard for assessing true technical capabilities of SME companies? I mean, market share is a high level data. So Michael, that's a good question. I think you have to be both qualitative and quantitative here. Of course, if you are the market leader in terms of a technical capability in the semiconductor industry, both in equipment as well as in and on the fab side, you can expect to have enormous market share. If you are the only company in the world that could do EUV lithography machines, then you could expect to have 100% market share in that, and vice versa throughout. So what does it mean when China currently has, Jacob, what did you show, about somewhere between 4 and 5% market share globally? They're thinly spread out everywhere, right? And so what will be interesting to see is, well, none of them are true market leaders, meaning if you're building a fab somewhere in the world, can you run that fab without US or European or Japanese equipment? The answer is no, right? Because you have market leaders in each of those countries. You cannot run a fab without those equipment and those companies. Can you run a fab without any Chinese equipment? The answer is yes, you can run a fab without Chinese equipment so far. So the question will be, can we still say that 10 years from now, right? As much as we ask about the choke points that the US or Europeans or Japanese might have in trying to slow down the Chinese development of semiconductor industry, will they then have 10, 20 years from now, choke points of their own to imply, kind of like what they do with rare earth minerals today? And I think that'll be really interesting to see. And as with any export control policy, I think any good policymaker, and I work with many of them, are also thinking about R&D policy alongside of that, right? Because you can't just think of export controls and choke points as a short-term thing. You have to continue to develop them in a technology competition if you're really wanting to win it. And again, you have to measure these wins in decades and not in quarters.
Thank you for weighing in on those questions. So we have another question in the chat about HBM, China's HBM development in particular. The question is, do you think the trends indicate that China is set up to lead in HBM development as we see the process shift from thermocompression bonding to hybrid bonding? Is there anybody who would like to tackle that question? I don't know, Saif, maybe, or anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think just like in logic production, we're seeing some national champions who are placing a pretty significant focus on HBM, and that includes CXMT, I would say. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's an area that we should expect to see more Chinese indigenous production over the coming years, especially by around next year or so. We'll probably see some more ramp of production there. It's unlikely that they're going to be reaching the scale, I think, for most projections that I've seen, at least of US and Korean companies, but it's certainly a place to look at. But welcome thoughts from the other panelists.
Yeah, I think in HBM, one of our analysts published recently tracking about 12 different companies across materials, tools, and fabless companies that are contributing, or at least trying to contribute to HBM development and self-sufficiency in China. Materials are really important here because material is a really critical function when you're packaging 8 to 12 stacks of DRAM die and then putting through, somewhere around like tens of thousands of through silicon vias. Materials, it becomes really important to control for the heat at that point. And so you really do need an entire technology stack. And today's HBM technology stack that is leading globally requires a global supply chain to enable that. But right now we are seeing Chinese companies, a variety of different types, trying to contribute to this, both in materials, tools, and also in the design.
Thank you both for weighing in on that. I see there's another question about subcomponents of tools. The question in particular is, do the major tool makers rely on suppliers of subcomponents in locations that are insecure? And I know we previously also mentioned, I think Saif, you mentioned subsystems and components being a critical piece of the story here, and maybe that's an area for further export controls. I think you also mentioned that it's not, the suppliers of those components are not all US based. So I don't know, Mario, if you want to weigh in maybe on that question in particular, where those companies are located.
Yeah, a lot of these subcomponents and subsystems are also high value, high IP, high value items that they themselves have very long R&D and development life cycles, right? Sometimes 5-7 years. The majority of these suppliers aren't in, the word insecure. I don't know what that means. They're these companies, these institutions. They're Asia, Japan, Taiwan, many in Europe. So, I mean, I think the term insecure, I don't know, maybe vulnerable might be a better word. There's a question in the chat on what, other than export controls, what other areas would the SME industry be vulnerable to? It's rare earths, right? Critical minerals, right? You need permanent magnets to manipulate the plasma in order to lay the metal down, right? There's about 70 miles of metal in a chip today, right? The chip in your iPhone. So a company like ours lays all that metal down, right? So permanent magnets are critical. So yes, we have to have some sort of national strategy on how to address those critical materials, right? And have some idea of how to secure that supply chain, because they're very, very important. Just looking at the questions. I mean, the subsystems is a very interesting, question for government. And I think if we are going to, I'd say, double down on some of these areas, we have to kind of take a hard look at that supply chain upstream.
Perfect. Thank you for weighing in. I think, there's a question in particular about, we focus a lot on export controls, which can be kind of seen as a stick policy. And this is something that Jacob and I have talked a lot about as well, is that we can't just focus on, right, export controls as being the primary tool, right? We have to do more with, making sure that we can succeed here in the US, that our US companies are, that the US is positioned to succeed. So the question is, can you talk a little bit more about some of the carrot policies that countries can implement to help compete against China? And so I think I'll kick that over to you, Dan, given your experience at the CHIPS office.
Well, listen, I think we have Mario here who can tell you what his company needs to succeed. Let me take a couple of guesses. Okay. One, I think market access is incredibly important in both import and export. Let me sort of dive into each of those. So as much as we like to talk about fabs having like 3,000 suppliers to enable a fab, I'm pretty sure that the equipment companies themselves are also a huge supply chain companies, right? They have like ASML, I think they've published that they have something like 5,000 suppliers. So their ability to import goods without, for example, tariffs or other import barriers is really important, because that anything that they have to pay when they're importing goods across the border is a tax they have to pay in order for them to assemble their tools. And I think they might argue that if there are tariffs imposed on those subcomponents they have to import, then the most logical thing to do would be to assemble them elsewhere. And so I think being able to import goods, I think, is really important. Being able to export goods, I think, is also important as well. If you're a US company, US consumption of equipment last year was about 13%. So more than 80% of their market access is somewhere else. And the uncomfortable truth is that most of the growth of equipment consumption has been in China, where there's what also has been a target of export controls. And so I think they rightly have, they clearly have the interest in and the right to express opinion as to how those should be shaped, because when the highest growth market for your good is essentially market access risk, then your ability to invest more in R&D, and you're very capital heavy, it just becomes very unpredictable for you to operate. And so I would say, like, think about the export and import policies that would essentially enable the equipment companies. Notice that I didn't really mention too much about the subsidies. I would venture to say that get the principle of market access policies correct, and then then the subsidies could do something further. But if without the first two things, I think the companies would be at a disadvantage.
Thanks, Sam. Brian, do you want to weigh in? Yeah, go ahead.
Can't teed me up. So there are two principal pillars that the semiconductor industry just stands on, if you will. That's technological innovation and that sale, right? That revenue flow, that's market segment share flow. Companies in the semiconductor industry have to reinvest massive amounts of money of that revenue into R&D. Like, you just have to. At any given point in time, you may have maybe 5 to 7 technological inflections that are being demanded by customers, but also demanded by just industrial development, right? Technological development. Companies have to pick what of those 7 trends they need to invest R&D in, right? So the more money you make, well, guess what? You can invest more in those, for example, 7 technology inflections. The less money you make, well, guess what? You're going to have to make some very, very hard decisions on where you're going to invest your money and which inflection you're going to put your money on. If you happen to make the wrong decision, well, that whole life cycle, you're not going to be able to commercialize that, because industry went with another inflection. So you have to leapfrog now to that next technological inflection period, whatever that is. So we have to be able to think about market access. We have to be able to think about revenue and market segment share vis-a-vis competitors, because it's the lifeblood of the industry. It's always been that way. We've just taken it for granted, right? We've always just, look, I'm going to get a new phone every 2 years. I'm going to get a new chip every 2 years. But as competition grows, I think we also have to think about how we're incentivizing that R&D investment. It's critical. It's super important. And as material science gets more complex, as the challenges of semiconductor applications become more complex, I think there's a question about AI and hyperscaling, et cetera. You need to be able to have ecosystem partners, semiconductor company, materials company, foundry, logic provider, all working together to solve these challenges. And that all happens together at the R&D phase. We all work together very, very closely with the supply chain. There's a lot of collegiality in R&D collaboration among the companies in the supply chain. So focusing on R&D is very, very important.
Thanks, Mario. And I think maybe a little bit related to that, somebody asked in the chat, bring the conversation a little bit back to Chinese companies, right? Somebody asked in the chat, or mentioned that an argument they hear about export controls is that they have spurred China's equipment progress because they've solved the kind of coordination problem for Chinese firms buying from and working with domestic companies versus buying from the superior foreign alternatives, right? Which has created greater integration and this R&D cooperation, right? Which you were just referring to. Curious if anybody has any reactions to this. And I think, yeah, I know we've touched on this a little bit, but curious how you would, maybe Saif, how you'd respond to that point in particular.
Yeah, it's a really great question that I think we need to keep our eyes on. Before getting to that specific question, I would say, there's another coordinating body, and that's obviously just the CCP. We see many cases. I'll just take one example. Shanghai ICRD. It's a major research center for semiconductor equipment that is publicly funded. And it's a place where, you bring together companies, tool providers, to develop and qualify tools for commercial production. And there's kind of many examples of that you can give where it is actually just the government who is kind of trying to solve that coordination problem, which I agree is a problem that exists for the ecosystem. On the more specific point about are the export controls further helping to solve the coordination problem, I think jury's out a little bit on kind of the size of the effect here. Obviously, we talked a little bit earlier that a lot of the places where Chinese equipment companies have gained market share or better capabilities have actually been in legacy segments, which are less restricted or not restricted. And so it's a place where you've just seen Chinese companies being able to compete with U.S. and allied equipment companies. But then again, I mean, there's maybe some data points that suggest that there has been some swap out even in some fabs subject to export controls. It doesn't look to me like that is a primary driver, but I think it's certainly a risk that we need to pay attention to.
All right, and I think we are almost at time, so I'll just maybe give you all one last question that you can leave us with your thoughts on. In particular, I'm curious if you could maybe provide kind of your thoughts on what you expect kind of from the Trump administration's broader export control strategy for both chip controls and controls on SME moving forward. I know it's been a busy couple of days on the other side of the supply chain, on the chip export controls side, not as much the SME side, but curious if any of you would like to weigh in on what we can expect, what you're looking for in the next couple of months.
So one comment from me. Yeah, I mean, I think this is an area we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I think one thing we saw in the previous administration was an allied approach where, various supplier governments have, instituted their own controls. There has been a lingering issue, I would say, where U.S. controls have been more stringent than controls applied by certain allied governments. And so ideally what you would want to have in order to level the playing field and to make the controls more effective is to kind of match the controls between all of the supplier governments. And I think that I think is probably going to be a significant focus of discussion. I mean, I think there's also a big discussion on, to what degree, the administration will kind of partner with allies versus, using tools it has available to act in more unilateral ways. I think that's going to be the big question to watch.
Thanks, Saif. Dan, Mario?
Okay, I'll give Mario the last word because he actually is the one that has worked on the ground with equipment. I make no predictions as to what the administration will do, but I do have a question for them, and perhaps a bit of agitation for them to further clarify and to flesh out their view on export controls generally across the board. So if the idea announcement from yesterday, for example, is that we want an American technology stack to be utilized as much as possible everywhere, including in China, how far does that apply? Does that also apply to equipment? Does that also apply to where else does it apply? Or is it specific to the chips? I think everyone is sort of waiting to see what kind of clarification the administration could give in terms of its approach and philosophy about AI and technology generally that enables AI. So that's one, and I'd love to see that and fully expect them to do so. Well, I would leave you with just one anecdote that I think sometimes we forget. My foray into semiconductor was actually as a government official at the International Trade Commission. And Mario actually, at that point, helped me to learn about the industry at that point. So Mario, thank you for that. But they sent me to a seminar in California to essentially have like a week-long seminar to learn about the semiconductor industry, ins and outs of it. And one other person was there with me, and it was someone that they hired. Someone was hired by an equipment company. I think it was Lam at that point. And one of their senior vice presidents came along to help train this new person and said, we got this, I think it was Berkeley grad of electrical engineering, and we were able to get this person here. And it dawned on me at that time how much talent development is important for the equipment industry. If we care about AI, we should care about every enabling technology that contributes to that. If we care about semiconductors, we should care about equipment too, because equipment and the innovation that goes into equipment and materials is ultimately what enables all of that. If we don't have a pipeline of talent that goes into that, then we no longer become a competitive place long term to be the leader in that space. And so I'm hopeful that we pay attention closely to workforce development and talent development in the equipment and fundamental research as well. Not just in the AI programmer aspect of it, but in the basic level science that contributes to equipment and other fundamental research.
Thanks, Dan, for bringing up the talent point as well. I know we didn't get to talk about that as much today, but a very important point. All right, Mario, over to you for the last comments.
Huge responsibility. I'd like to thank you all and Dan and say for your insights. I feel like I'm the least expert of the group, so I'll try to be wise in my closing remarks. I think we have to think about the semiconductor industry as not being a monolith, right? It's much more than that. And there are different segments of the stack that are very, very critical. And when we think about what, in order to scale AI, this future AI that everyone's kind of focused on, not just here in Washington, but globally, you gotta really focus on the types of inflections, technological innovations that are going to be necessary to meet that scalable future, right? The commercial future. Compound semiconductors, optical interconnects, 3D integration, leading edge logic, compute memory, all very, very critical to that future. You can't do any of that without semiconductor manufacturing equipment and material science. You just can't. You can build all the fabs you want, you can fund all the fabs you want, but you won't be able to do it. So I would say, I don't know what the future of export controls looks like, but just remember, if you want to lead and you want to maintain dominance or whatnot, you have to ensure that the entire stack is well looked after with talent, R&D fuel, in order to make that future a reasonable likelihood, right? So I hope that's wise enough, and I'd like to thank you all for participating. Thank you.
If I could add just one quick comment. As Dan said,
Okay.
China looks at this long term, and I hope we can get the band back together to talk about this maybe in another 5 years to take stock of where we're at that point.
Exactly. Everybody can look out for an invitation to that in 2030. Well, with that, really just a huge thank you to our audience for joining us today and for sticking around a few minutes longer, and especially to our panelists for such a lively and engaging discussion. Always learn so much from you all. We appreciate really everybody's questions, and I'm very sorry we couldn't get to them all. There were many great questions in the chat. We'll follow up soon with more details about our next CSAT webinar. But yeah, in the meantime, you can sign up for additional updates and learn more about CSAT at csat.georgetown.edu. Follow us on social media or check out the blog or the tool that Jacob highlighted earlier in the discussion as well. Hope you all have a great rest of your day, and looking forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you.